We established in video 6 that the journey Jesus makes to heaven by way of Jerusalem, recorded by Luke in chapter 9, verse 51 to chapter 24, verse 53, is both literal and symbolic. But now we need to account for why Luke emphasizes that Christ's journey was divided into distinct parts, or stages. To understand why Luke does this, we first have to survey how Luke marks off these stages for his readers. The beginning of Christ's journey is found in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. When the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But if we jump a few stories ahead, listen to chapter 10, verse 38. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. The question naturally arises, as they went on their way, to where? And the answer is clearly, as they went on their way to Jerusalem. Because this statement is found only a handful of stories after the beginning of their journey, Luke doesn't need to repeat their destination. But that's clearly what he means. He has even framed this first group of stories from their journey with something unique. The first story in chapter 9, verse 51 is about how Jesus enters a village of the Samaritans, but is rejected. The final story before the journey marker at chapter 10, verse 38, includes the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. These two stories about Samaritans act like bookends to the first stage of Christ's journey. And intriguingly, the stories are a striking contrast to one another. In the first story, the Samaritans proved to be decidedly unneighborly. They refused to lodge Jesus and his disciples in their village. But in the last story, Jesus has deliberately selected a Samaritan to play the starring role of an ideal neighbor. Why would he do this if in reality the Samaritans were so rude and hostile to him? Well, we won't stop and try to explain this here, but only point out that Luke has written this first stage of the journey with a careful hand, in order to help the reader to note that this is the first stage of the journey, and that the stories within the first stage are closely related to one another. If we continue reading after chapter 10, verse 38, we won't find another reference to their journey to Jerusalem until we come to chapter 13, verse 22. Jesus went on his way through towns and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. This journey reference marks the end of the second stage of Christ's journey. If we keep reading, we find the next journey marker in chapter 17, verse 11. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. This marks the end of the third stage of their journey. The fourth journey marker is found in chapter 19, verse 28. When Jesus had said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. This marks the end of the fourth stage of their journey. And in Luke chapter 24, verse 51, at the very end of the gospel, we read, "While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven." This last marker signifies the end of the fifth and clearly final stage of the journey, where Jesus ascends climactically to heaven. So Luke has recorded the journey in 5 stages. But why do this? What practical effect does this have on our reading of his account? Let's take an example from our own traveling experience. When we begin a family road trip, the beginning of the trip is very different from the middle, which is very different from the end, especially if you have children. An important part of the beginning of the journey is preparing your children for what's ahead. What will they experience along the way? How long will it take? And most important of all, you have to assure them that they will at some point actually arrive, and that the journey will be worth the arduous trek. If we turn to the first stage of Christ's journey, we find many of these same themes. The disciples are taught that they will experience rejection and suffering along their journey to heaven. But they can take comfort in joy that their names are written already in heaven. No matter how many cities reject them here on earth, their citizenship in heaven is on reserve, and not even Satan himself can alter this fact. In other words, it's important at the beginning to lay out the entire trip, so that they feel better about their experiences along the way, and that is precisely what Jesus does for the disciples in the first stage of this journey. The second stage of Christ's journey is about choices. Listen to the climax of the first story in chapter 10. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Just because we have a plan for our family road trip doesn't mean we won't be faced with a lot of choices along the way. We'll need to stop and rest on occasion, for example, or we may hit bad weather or stumble upon a very appealing ice cream shop. In a similar way, Jesus teaches his disciples about the choices they face on their journey. More importantly, he teaches them what should be the underlying values that inform their choices and why these values matter. That's what the second stage is all about. We won't survey every stage, but you can see why it's important to Luke that we read Christ's journey in stages and that we pay attention to the particular stage of the journey and how that affects the lessons Jesus emphasizes. The fourth stage of the journey, however, is the stage we're most concerned about. That's the stage in which we find the story of Zacchaeus, which is the focus of this particular study on how to read a gospel. So what is the focus of this fourth stage of the journey, and how does Zacchaeus' experience contribute to this major focus of the fourth stage? We'll address these questions in our next video.